The annual Flaxborough Flower Show was as ever a quietly splendid affair. The town hall, with its faintly musty smell of polished wood and wilting carnations, had been transformed into a patchwork of asters, dahlias, and chrysanthemums. Mrs. Featherstone had arranged the begonia display with her usual meticulous precision, and Mr. Tilling, proprietor of the town's sole haberdashery, hovered nervously near the raffle table, checking and rechecking his ticket numbers as though the outcome of the draw might somehow reflect on his character. It was the sort of event where one could admire a particularly perfect marigold, while simultaneously gauging the social hierarchy by the subtle stiffness of a neighbour's bow or the exaggerated cheeriness of a friend's greeting. Inspector Pubright, however, had not come merely for floral delight. He was invited, ostensibly to lend a sense of civic gravitas, but he found the gentle hum of local chatter preferable to his usual paperwork. In the front row of folding chairs he noticed, as always, the way people behaved in public, the hesitant smiles, the careful avoidance of accidental shoulder brushes, the furtive glances that betrayed long-standing grievances disguised as amiable concern. The incident itself was, in a sense, minor. A shriek, a high, sharp, and utterly undignified sound, cut through the polite murmur of conversation. It came from near the refreshment table, where Mrs. Bunting, custodian of the town's tea service, stood frozen, her hands hovering over a tray of scones. On the floor lay a small rectangular object, a wallet, rather battered, which Mrs. Bunting insisted had been just lying there, though everyone present knew it could belong to nobody in particular. "It's... oh, heavens!" she repeated, clutching her pearls with a trembling hand. Instantly the hall filled with speculation. "Stolen," someone whispered, though nothing had been taken. "Dropped by accident," offered another, cautiously aware of Mrs. Bunting's dramatic flair. Pubright observed, silently enjoying the minor uproar. The wallet, which bore no obvious identification, was picked up and turned over delicately by Mr. Tilling, who frowned as though the correct handling of a suspicious object might prevent a scandal. Mrs. Featherstone gasped audibly, as if the floral arrangements themselves might be offended by such impropriety. A few of the younger attendees giggled, hiding behind their programmes, while others began to exchange theories with the polite seriousness of detectives in waiting. "It could have been dropped by that man from the station," said one, nodding toward Mr. Eddington, the railway clerk, who merely coughed and rearranged his tie. Or perhaps by Mrs. Larkins. She was looking rather flustered this morning. Pubright did not interrupt. Instead, he watched the subtle ripples of human nature, the discomfort of being eyed, the instinctive urge to assert innocence, and the rapid, almost imperceptible calculations that each attendee made about what would be said, remembered, or repeated in tomorrow's tea-room conversation. He noted, with a quiet satisfaction, that nobody seemed to notice the small detail that intrigued him most, the wallet's unusual stitching, a peculiar shade of green that might or might not be significant. To everyone else, it was merely another item, inconsequential amidst flowers and finger sandwiches. To Pubright, everything was a potential clue, though, as ever, he would not act hastily. By the time the town's vicar had whispered a discreetly moralising comment about honesty and God's watchful eye, the initial flurry of excitement had subsided into murmurs of conjecture. Mrs. Bunting, having regained some composure, resumed her careful arrangement of teacups, while the townsfolk gradually returned to the pleasures of gentle competition and the occasional overzealous sniff of a prize-winning bloom. Pubright made a quiet mental note. Something minor had disturbed the ordinary order of things. How, when, and why were questions best left to unfold in their own time. In Flaxborough, the smallest events often concealed the most interesting truths, and as he glanced toward the curtained windows at the back of the hall, he thought fleetingly of the neighbour who always watched from behind them, a habit so ingrained that no one seemed to notice, yet which might, if considered carefully, prove relevant in ways that no one could yet imagine. The murmurs grew louder as the townsfolk filed out of the hall, clutching their programmes and exchanging conjectures with the kind of seriousness reserved for matters of civic importance. In the marketplace, the story of the wallet spread quickly, each retelling reshaped by personality and prejudice. Mrs. Featherstone's version was precise and horrified, Mr. Tilling's anxious and slightly accusing, and Mrs. Bunting herself, magnanimous in the aftermath, insisted it was a mere accident, though her tone suggested a lingering need to be acknowledged for her shock. Inspector Pubright strolled through the crowd, nodding politely at acquaintances while observing the undercurrents of expression. He had learned long ago that in Flaxborough, the truth often hid beneath layers of civility, embarrassment and competitive storytelling. Each embellishment revealed something about the teller, and each hesitation suggested a small, carefully guarded truth. He first approached Mr. Eddington, who was fidgeting with his watch chain by the railway gates. "I believe you were near the hall when the commotion began," Pubright said gently. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Eddington coughed. "Nothing out of the ordinary, Inspector. People are always dropping things, you know. Mrs. Bunting is terribly dramatic, but she means well." "Yes, quite. And the wallet?" Pubright asked, allowing his tone to convey interest without urgency. The clerk's lips tightened. "I suppose I saw it on the floor, yes, but I didn't touch it. I didn't want to seem forward." Pubright nodded, accepting the statement at face value, while noting the slight tremor in the man's hand, a subtle trace of anxiety, nothing more. He moved on, speaking with Mrs. Larkins next, whose morning fluster had been widely remarked upon. She was polishing her spectacles and peering at him with mild suspicion. "I merely entered to see the dahlias," she said, "and the wallet. Well, it was simply there. I did not touch it, of course. I think people are far too ready to assume mischief in Flaxborough these days." "Quite so," Pubright replied, observing the way she avoided looking at the wallet itself, which sat neatly folded on a chair, its green stitching catching a thin shaft of afternoon sunlight. As he wandered back toward the hall, he noticed Mr. Tilling speaking earnestly to a group of younger gentlemen. "If someone was careless enough to leave a wallet lying about," Tilling said, "then they must bear responsibility. We must be vigilant." Pubright allowed a faint smile. Vigilance, indeed, was a fine virtue in Flaxborough, particularly when exercised on one's neighbours. The inspector's attention, however, remained on the minor details. The green stitching, the faint scent of leather mixed with faintly floral perfume, and the fact that nobody seemed genuinely concerned about the wallet's owner. By the following morning, the town's interest had not waned. Gossip, like ivy, crept over every conversation. At the post office, in the market stalls, and even along the riverbank, each retelling added layers of conjecture. The wallet had belonged to a visitor, or perhaps to a well-to-do resident testing the honesty of their neighbours. Someone had tried to steal it, or perhaps to plant it as a jest. Pubright sat quietly in his office, examining the wallet at last. There was no money inside, no identification beyond a card embossed with initials he did not immediately recognise, and yet something about its neat, careful construction struck him as deliberate. The green stitching was uncommon. Such craftsmanship was rarely accidental. He considered the possibility that it had been left for someone to find, a small act meant to provoke observation rather than theft. As he reflected, a knock sounded at his door. Constable Carter entered, cheeks flushed from the morning chill. "Inspector, Mrs. Bunting wishes to speak with you again. She says she noticed something odd after everyone left the hall." Pubright raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? And what might that be?" Carter shuffled uneasily. "She's not certain, but she thinks she saw someone watching from the windows behind the hall curtains. A neighbour, she says, who always keeps a careful eye on the proceedings as if they expect to learn more than is offered," Pubright finished, with the quiet precision that had unnerved many before. He stood, taking the wallet and slipping it into his coat pocket. The threads of Flaxborough's social fabric were subtle, he knew, but where there were observant eyes, small anomalies became telling. And the neighbour behind the curtain, who had gone unnoticed all afternoon, might just prove the key to an otherwise trivial affair. By mid-afternoon, Pubright had arranged a polite visit to the house in question. The resident, Mr. Callender, received him with the customary civility, offering tea and insisting upon the proprieties of social hosting. Pubright engaged him in gentle conversation, noting the faint tension beneath the calm voice, the careful phrasing of his responses, and the habitual gaze toward the street through half-drawn curtains. It was not confrontation that revealed truths in Flaxborough. It was patience, the accumulation of small observations. And as Pubright sipped his tea and allowed the clock to tick, he realised that the wallet, the hall, the gossip, all were pieces of a quiet puzzle, waiting only for the final, unobtrusive move that would bring clarity. Pubright left Mr. Callender's house with the same quiet composure that accompanied all his movements. The green-stitched wallet remained in his coat pocket, its presence oddly comforting, an object so unremarkable yet so suggestive of human subtlety. The inspector wandered the marketplace slowly, observing the town as if for the first time since the flower show, taking note of who avoided whom, which hands fidgeted with gloves, and whose laughter carried a slightly forced edge. By mid-morning, he had arranged a brief meeting with the vicar, who was always ready with a moral perspective on minor scandals. "Inspector," the vicar said, stirring his tea and raising an eyebrow, "the mind of Flaxborough is a curious thing. Everyone knows everything and nothing at all." "Precisely," Pubright replied, "which is why a seemingly trivial incident can reveal more than a serious one might. Take, for instance, a wallet on the floor." The vicar peered at him, but said nothing, which was customary when Pubright spoke with his quiet authority. Indeed, silence often proved more revealing than speech. As the morning passed, Pubright began quietly interviewing those who had been closest to the incident. Mrs. Bunting repeated her account of shock and dismay, carefully emphasising her reluctance to handle the wallet. She also mentioned that the object seemed heavier than expected, as if something had been removed before she arrived. Pubright nodded, concealing any hint of interest. Next, he spoke with Mr. Tilling, who seemed almost relieved to have an official reason to articulate his suspicions. "Of course," he said, "it must have been someone careless. But carelessness in Flaxborough often conceals intent, doesn't it, Inspector?" Pubright allowed a faint smile, neither confirming nor denying. He noted Tilling's gaze flick toward the corner of the room where the wallet might have been found and filed it away mentally. There was something about the way Tilling framed carelessness that suggested he knew more than he admitted. As the afternoon drew on, the inspector visited several other townsfolk, each providing small, inconsistent details that, while individually insignificant, together formed a subtle mosaic of behaviour. A neighbour had noticed Mr. Callender lingering near the hall windows in the early morning. A baker mentioned seeing a figure dropping a small green object along the lane, though he could not be sure whose it was. Pubright paused in front of the curtained windows of the hall, reflecting on the interactions of the day. There was no rush in Flaxborough, and he understood that, unlike in larger cities, patience revealed far more than insistence. One needed only to observe minute shifts in posture, sudden hesitation in speech, the involuntary glance toward a small but telling object. Later, as evening settled over the town, he returned to his office to review his notes. A faint sense of movement outside caught his attention, and he looked up to see Mr. Callender's curtains trembling ever so slightly, as if some curiosity could not be contained. Pubright smiled imperceptibly. The neighbour who watched, the wallet with its unusual stitching, the petty anxieties of Tilling and Bunting, all were threads of a pattern that, once properly traced, would reveal the quiet, precise truth beneath the town's surface civility. The investigation so far had not required urgency or dramatic confrontations, only the careful accumulation of observations. Pubright reflected that in Flaxborough, the smallest incidents often exposed the greatest truths, provided one was willing to watch, wait, and listen. And, as he arranged his notes for the following day's inquiries, he understood that tomorrow would bring the next stage, a seemingly obvious suspect whose apparent guilt would conceal the more subtle reality. The night deepened over Flaxborough, and in the quiet of his office Pubright sipped his tea, feeling the familiar satisfaction of an investigation unfolding with its own gentle inevitability. Nothing had been solved yet, but all the pieces were beginning to speak to him, in whispers rather than shouts, demanding only patience and discernment to reveal the truth. By mid-morning, Flaxborough's local constabulary had already begun to form a tidy narrative around the wallet incident. Constable Carter, eager to demonstrate diligence, spoke of a most likely culprit before Pubright had even arrived at the station. According to Carter, the wallet could only belong to Mr. Eddington, whose presence near the hall windows and the railway station earlier that morning seemed to confirm, at least superficially, a convenient story of mishap, or mischief. Pubright listened politely, nodding as Carter elaborated on the clerk's minor inconsistencies and the convenience of circumstance. "He seemed nervous, sir," Carter concluded. "Quite naturally, of course, when accused, though I thought perhaps it was more than mere nervousness." "Yes," Pubright replied softly, allowing the words to hang without endorsement. "But nervousness is a common trait in Flaxborough these days." With that, he set out to speak with Mr. Eddington himself, arriving at the modest railway clerk's home in the early afternoon. Eddington greeted him with carefully measured politeness, his expression betraying a faint mixture of relief and apprehension. "Inspector," he said, brushing the edge of his collar, "I trust this is merely a formality." "Merely to understand the facts," Pubright said evenly. "It seems a wallet was found at the flower show, and some attention has been drawn to your proximity at the time." Eddington stiffened. "I assure you, sir, I had no involvement. I was at the hall, yes, but only in my official capacity, checking the delivery of some correspondence and tickets. I noticed nothing untoward until the shriek, at which point I observed the wallet on the floor, as did everyone else." Pubright inclined his head, watching closely. The words were careful, the pauses deliberate, yet there was nothing in the tone or posture to suggest outright deception. And yet, something about Eddington's habitual glance toward the window, toward the street beyond, caught the inspector's attention. Returning to the station, Pubright allowed the constable to dwell on the supposed evidence against Eddington, while he reviewed the minor anomalies he had observed over the preceding days, the peculiar green stitching, the subtle interest of Mr. Calendar at his curtained windows, and the various whispered conversations of those who had witnessed the incident. Each detail was trivial in isolation, but suggested a wider pattern that others had yet to perceive. Later, he revisited Mrs. Bunting, noting again her insistence that she had seen someone peering from the windows, a detail everyone else had overlooked or dismissed. "Did you notice anything unusual about the person?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Bunting hesitated, her lips pressed together. "Just the way he lingered, Inspector. Not out of malice, I think, but curiosity. Too much attention for a gentleman to be merely passing the time." Pubright nodded, not revealing that this small observation aligned neatly with his own suspicions. It was rarely the dramatic acts but the understated consistencies that spoke most clearly of intention. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, he made another circuit of the town, stopping to observe subtle interactions. Tilling's habitual overcorrecting of his bow toward passers-by, the vicar's eyes following even minor disturbances, and Calendar's curtains trembling in a habitual curiosity. Each behaviour, small and seemingly inconsequential, reinforced the sense that the tidy narrative being drawn by the constabulary was incomplete. Pubright returned to his office, arranging his notes with precise care. He reflected on the nature of small-town observation, that it was rarely direct actions but rather repeated, quiet behaviours that revealed character. Nervousness, curiosity, a slight tremor of the hand, all were more telling than any rushed accusation. And in the case of the green-stitched wallet, he understood that the investigation was no longer about who dropped it, but about who intended it to be found and why. By evening, the town's chatter had subsided, leaving behind only the gentle hum of anticipation. Pubright sat back, sipping his tea and watching the last of the daylight fade over Flaxborough's rooftops. The first obvious suspect had been identified by others, yet he felt no urgency to confirm it. Patience, he knew, would allow the subtler threads to reveal themselves, and it was those threads, woven of curiosity, meticulousness, and understated intent, that would ultimately guide him to the truth. The following morning, Pubright found the town stirring with the slow deliberateness typical of Flaxborough. Conversations over tea and toast inevitably returned to the flower show and the wallet, each recounting slightly adjusted to suit the teller's perspective. He wandered through the market, exchanging polite nods with shopkeepers, all the while observing the subtle undercurrents of tension and expectation. It was in the quiet of the baker's shop, while pretending to examine freshly baked rolls, that he first heard something worth noting. Mrs. Larkins, arranging her basket of preserves, murmured to the assistant, "I suppose it's ridiculous, but I did notice something odd about Calendar yesterday. The way he moved toward the windows, as if he were waiting for someone to arrive." Pubright paused, letting a faint smile touch his lips. It was not a confirmation, but the subtle corroboration of a detail he had already noted. He returned briefly to the hall where the incident had occurred, wandering among the empty chairs and polished floors. The wallet still lay where it had been placed, though the initial curiosity surrounding it had waned. Yet, as he examined it, he became aware of a pattern. Every person who had interacted with it displayed small, telling behaviours, fidgeting, overemphasis on propriety, or the gentle avoidance of certain glances. Human nature in Flaxborough expressed itself not through dramatic confession, but through these minor repeated acts. That afternoon, he arranged a polite visit with Mr. Tilling, whose anxiety over the wallet's presence and the potential gossip had been palpable. They discussed minor civic matters, the conversation polite yet layered with nuance. Pubright noted Tilling's habitual straightening of his tie and the occasional glance toward a drawer where letters and small trinkets were kept. These gestures, seemingly inconsequential, revealed a mind concerned with propriety and reputation above all. Later, speaking with Mrs. Bunting once more, Pubright encouraged her to recount the events with attention to detail. Her description of Calendar's presence by the curtained windows, his habitual, almost imperceptible watchfulness, reinforced a notion the inspector had long suspected, that the wallet incident, while outwardly trivial, had been observed and perhaps orchestrated by someone whose subtle attention to detail was both habitual and meticulous. By early evening, Pubright returned to his office to collate his notes. He reflected on the interconnected behaviours he had observed: nervousness, habitual curiosity, and the careful orchestration of appearances. Flaxborough's citizens were, individually, inconspicuous, yet collectively their behaviours created a web of small actions and reactions. The green-stitched wallet, the fleeting glances, the whispers, all pointed toward a deeper understanding of intent. Pubright sipped his tea and allowed the quiet of the office to settle over him. There would be a second incident soon enough, he thought, subtle yet meaningful, which would draw the investigation toward its next phase. In Flaxborough, the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary, and he was content to wait, watch, and listen, knowing that patience and careful observation were the surest instruments in uncovering the truth. The second incident came quietly, as most meaningful events did in Flaxborough. It was early morning when Mrs. Featherstone discovered that a prize-winning vase had been moved from its usual place in the hall to the edge of the windowsill, tilted ever so slightly as if nudged by an invisible hand. No one had entered the hall since the flower show, save for a few townsfolk checking on their exhibits, yet the vase's displacement was unmistakable. Word travelled quickly, though, as usual, it acquired layers of interpretation with each retelling. In the market, Mrs. Larkins insisted that it must have been deliberate, a sign of mischief, while Mr. Tilling speculated in hushed tones that the act hinted at carelessness that could not go unremarked. The vicar, consulting with the parish council, suggested that even the smallest disturbances carried moral significance. Pubright arrived at the hall soon after, noting the subtle details at once: the precise angle of the vase, the faint smudge on the windowsill, and the absence of footprints on the polished floor. He asked Mrs. Bunting to recount who had visited since the show. Each visitor she named seemed routine, harmless, and yet one person's habitual pattern of observation emerged: Mr. Calendar, whose lingering at the curtained windows had already drawn the inspector's quiet attention. It was the repetition of behaviour, Pubright reflected, that spoke most clearly. The wallet, the watchful glances, the deliberate observation of others' reactions, these were not accidents. They were minor acts, orchestrated with patience, intended to draw notice without inviting direct accusation. He noted how even the smallest disruption, a shifted vase, could provoke comment, tension, and revealing gestures. By mid-afternoon, Pubright had spoken with several townsfolk, confirming details that strengthened his understanding of the subtle social mechanics at play. Eddington's account remained consistent and plausible. Tilling continued his anxious speculation, and Calendar, as ever, maintained an appearance of civility that concealed his intense habitual scrutiny. The inspector spent much of the day in quiet reflection, considering human nature in its Flaxborough guise, the polite concealment of motives, the gentle layering of observation and intention, the microcosms of rivalry and curiosity that defined civic life. He understood that the first obvious suspect, while convenient for others, was a red herring, insufficiently attentive to the nuances that had led to the wallet's discovery and the vase's displacement. In the late afternoon, he returned to his office, reviewing the morning's observations. There was no urgency, only the accumulation of careful telling details: the green-stitched wallet, the habitual attention of Calendar, the slight tremors of Tilling's hands, and the understated anxiety in Eddington's posture. Each thread contributed to a pattern discernible only to one patient enough to watch and wait. Pubright sipped his tea and allowed the quiet of the evening to settle over him. The town would continue its speculations, each person overlaying the events with personal interpretation, while the truth, quiet, precise and understated, gathered shape in the mind of the inspector. Soon, he knew, a polite but deliberate test would be required to draw the final thread into view, revealing the subtle intentions behind what everyone else assumed were minor accidents. That evening, Pubright sat alone in his office, the soft lamplight casting long shadows across neatly stacked papers, and the open notebook where he had catalogued every observation from the flower show and subsequent incidents. The quiet was deliberate, allowing the mind to wander through the subtleties that others would have dismissed. In Flaxborough, human nature rarely revealed itself through dramatic gestures. It was in the habitual, the almost imperceptible, and the carefully orchestrated pauses that truth lay concealed. He reviewed each small anomaly, the wallet with its unusual green stitching, carefully placed yet apparently innocuous, the shifted vase too slight to be noticed by anyone inattentive, the habitual peering from behind Calendar's curtains, and the nervous gestures of those closest to the events. Individually, these details were trivial. Together they formed a lattice of intention and observation, each point a silent testament to character. Pubright considered the town's inclination to assign blame prematurely. Eddington's proximity had made him an easy target, and Tilling's anxiety had fueled speculation. Yet neither had demonstrated the patience or subtlety required to engineer such small, attention-drawing disturbances. Calendar, by contrast, exhibited the precise combination of curiosity, methodical observation, and understated manipulation that spoke most convincingly of orchestrated attention. He reflected on the nature of small-town reputations. In Flaxborough, respectability was maintained through vigilance, habitual civility, and the careful management of perception. A wallet on the floor, a vase slightly displaced. These were not mere accidents. They were opportunities for the observant to test the attentiveness of their neighbours, to provoke subtle reactions and to confirm suspicions without overtly challenging the social order. Sipping his tea, Pubright allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. The next stage, he realised, would be simple yet telling, a carefully staged remark or encounter that would reveal the guilty party's intent without confrontation, allowing civility to mask the revelation even as the truth emerged. In Flaxborough, as elsewhere, patience and attentiveness were the surest instruments of justice, and he had observed enough to know precisely how to apply them. The night deepened, the town settled, and the inspector remained at his desk, quietly arranging the threads of observation into the subtle framework that would guide his next move. Tomorrow he would allow human nature to speak for itself, and in its quiet utterances the truth would be laid bare. The following afternoon, Pubright made his way once more to Mr. Calendar's house, this time with a particular purpose in mind. The sun slanted through the high windows, illuminating the familiar curtains that had been drawn in cautious anticipation. Calendar greeted him with his customary civility, offering tea and mild conversation, as though the day's events were routine, though the habitual tension in his posture suggested a mind alert to subtle provocations. Pubright engaged him in discussion of local matters, deliberately guiding the conversation towards small incidents, the flower show, the wallet, the vase, without directly accusing. "It is remarkable," Pubright observed quietly, "how minor events can sometimes reveal so much about those who observe them." He allowed the remark to hang, neither pointed nor dismissive, and took careful note of Calendar's reactions. The slight narrowing of eyes, the subtle straightening of shoulders, the gentle involuntary glance toward the green-sticked wallet Pubright had placed on the table, casually, as though it belonged there. Calendar's attention lingered. He sipped his tea with deliberate slowness, his fingers brushing the edge of the cup, betraying an almost imperceptible restlessness. Pubright allowed a faint smile. It was precisely these small, consistent gestures, habitual vigilance and subtle curiosity, that spoke more clearly than any confession could. After a few more minutes of civil dialogue, Pubright shifted his tone with the gentlest of emphasis. "It is curious how sometimes people take care to watch what others might miss, is it not? One might learn much from observing without intervening, though the consequences of inadvertent oversight can be revealing." Calendar's hand twitched, a brief motion barely perceptible, yet enough to confirm the inspector's suspicions. The habitual watcher had, without realizing, betrayed the precise intent Pubright had suspected all along. The wallet, the vase, the careful attention from behind the curtains, all minor disturbances designed not to harm, but to provoke observation, to test attentiveness, and to satisfy a quiet curiosity about the town's reactions. Pubright inclined his head politely. "Mr. Calendar, I trust you understand that the little exercises of observation, while harmless in intent, have created rather more discussion than anyone anticipated." He paused, allowing the civility of the room to maintain its calm veneer. "It seems that the green-sticked wallet and the slightly moved vase were instruments in a private experiment, one that relied upon subtlety and patience rather than force or deception." Calendar's composure faltered, only just in the almost imperceptible tightening of his lips. "Inspector, I only wished to see how attentive my neighbours were," he murmured, the words gentle, almost apologetic. Pubright smiled lightly, as one might acknowledge a minor lesson learned. "Indeed, and in doing so you have revealed both the attentiveness and the character of those around you. Flaxborough may continue to chatter, as it always does, but the truth, as I have observed, rests in the quiet actions rather than in conjecture." The room settled into polite silence, and for a moment all was as it had always been. The experiment concluded, the mystery quietly understood, the social fabric of Flaxborough intact, yet subtly altered by the insights revealed. Pubright took his leave, the afternoon light falling gently over the town as he returned to his habitual walk through the streets, satisfied that patience, observation, and quiet civility had once again brought clarity. The following morning, Flaxborough stirred with its usual blend of curiosity and civility, the townsfolk quietly anticipating the ongoing discussions about the wallet and the shifted vase. Inspector Pubright, having completed his polite test the previous day, moved among the streets with measured ease, observing the subtle reactions of those who'd taken part, directly or indirectly, in the minor disruptions. At the market, Mrs. Larkins whispered to a neighbour about the curious behaviour she had noticed from Mr. Calendar, while Tilling fussed over his papers with the mild anxiety that had become habitual. Eddington, for his part, carried on with his railway duties, unconsciously exuding an air of unaffected propriety that contrasted with the nervous tension of others. Each individual, in their own manner, had revealed something of themselves, and Pubright noted it all with quiet satisfaction. By mid-morning, he convened a small civil gathering at the hall. Mrs. Bunting, Tilling, Eddington, and several other residents had been invited under the pretext of reviewing the flower show arrangements for the next season. The wallet, neatly folded and untouched, rested on a side table. Pubright allowed the conversation to drift toward minor civic topics, gently guiding remarks to the recent incidents without dramatizing them. Finally he spoke, his tone unobtrusive yet precise. "I believe we can now understand the occurrences of the past few days with some clarity. It is tempting, as we have seen, to assign responsibility based on proximity or nervous behaviour, but the truth is rarely so obvious. In Flaxborough, the ordinary often conceals a subtle layer of intention." He gestured lightly toward the wallet. This object, along with the slightly displaced vase, was not merely misplaced or mishandled. They were observed carefully by a member of our community, with the intent of testing attentiveness rather than committing any harm. All eyes turned, curiosity mingled with polite uncertainty. The person responsible, Pubright continued, was neither careless nor malicious. They acted quietly, with precision, observing the reactions of others while maintaining their customary civility. It is a behaviour that speaks of habit and meticulous attention, rather than impropriety. A pause followed, delicate and civil, before Mr. Calendar inclined his head, acknowledging the implication with a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh. "Inspector," he said softly, "I only wish to see how attentive everyone was, to notice, to respond, to care." Pubright inclined his own head in acknowledgement, his expression neutral but kindly. "And in doing so, Mr. Calendar, you have revealed the attentiveness and character of those around you, as well as the subtle dynamics that shape our little town. The wallet and the vase were instruments in this gentle observation, and nothing more. Flaxborough's routines, its civility, and its social fabric remain intact, though perhaps slightly enriched by the insights we have quietly gleaned." The residents exchanged polite glances, some tinged with relief, others with the mild amusement that often accompanies understanding in Flaxborough. Conversations resumed in their usual subdued manner, the town's rhythms returning to their customary pattern. Pubright collected his notes in the green-sticked wallet, his task complete, yet satisfied that the gentle, quiet experiment had provided both clarity and civility. By evening, the streets were calm, the marketplace emptied, and the town had resumed its routines, though beneath the surface, subtle awareness lingered. Pubright returned to his office, arranging his papers with the meticulous care that had guided the investigation from its inception. In Flaxborough, as always, the ordinary concealed the extraordinary, but it was patience, observation, and quiet civility that revealed it, and on that evening all was once more in order. The morning air in Flaxborough was crisp, carrying with it the gentle hum of a town resuming its habitual pace. Shops opened on schedule, the baker arranged his freshly baked loaves with meticulous care, and the railway clerk, Mr. Eddington, moved efficiently through his routine, entirely oblivious to the subtle tension that had lingered over the past days. Pubright, however, noticed it all. The small, almost imperceptible adjustments in posture, the careful selection of words in casual conversation, the habitual glances toward familiar windows and corners. He took his time walking through the marketplace, observing the townfolk as they went about their daily duties. Mrs. Larkins was arranging jars of preserves, her movements precise yet slightly accelerated, perhaps reflecting the quiet unease of having observed events that were, to the outsider, minor, but to the attentive, revealing. Mr. Tilling fussed over his documents, correcting margins and realigning papers with habitual nervousness. Even the vicar, strolling with a measured pace, cast a discreet glance toward the hall, as though testing the calm of the day against the minor disruptions that had passed. By mid-morning, Pubright returned to the hall, his purpose subtle yet deliberate. He moved slowly through the empty chairs and polished floors, noting once again the green-sticked wallet on the side table. It was not merely an object, but a symbol of the small intricacies that had begun to unfold over the week, the minor disturbances, the habitual observations, the carefully measured curiosities of a town that thrived on propriety and quiet social manoeuvring. He summoned Mrs. Bunting, Mr. Calendar, and a few others under the pretence of reviewing arrangements for an upcoming flower exhibit. The atmosphere was civil, polite, and lightly expectant. Pubright allowed small talk to drift naturally, guiding the discussion toward the minor incidents without dramatization, his voice calm and precise. "It is remarkable," he remarked, "how minor occurrences can reveal so much about those who witness them. Even the smallest object can provoke reactions that speak volumes about intention and character." Calendar, as always, maintained his veneer of civility, yet the faint tightening of his lips and the habitual glance toward the wallet betrayed the slight unrest he felt. Pubright continued gently, "We tend to assume that proximity or nervousness indicates culpability, yet it is often the subtler acts, the careful watching, the precise placement of items that demonstrate true intent." A silence settled over the room, polite yet charged with understanding. Calendar inclined his head almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the truth without words. "Inspector," he murmured, "I only wished to see how attentive my neighbours were." Pubright nodded lightly, satisfied with the resolution. "Indeed, and in observing you have revealed the attentiveness of those around you, the subtle dynamics of our community, and the quiet patterns that often go unnoticed. Flaxborough remains orderly, its civility intact, though subtly enriched by the insights these small incidents have provided." The townsfolk exchanged mild smiles and polite glances, the tension dissipating into the usual rhythms of the town. Conversations resumed, this time lighter, tempered by understanding and discreet amusement. Pubright collected his notes in the wallet, his task complete, and walked through the market, observing as Flaxborough returned to its quiet routines, the lessons of attentiveness lingering just beneath the surface. By evening the town was calm, the streets nearly empty, and Pubright returned to his office, arranging his papers with precise care. The investigation had revealed not malice or error, but curiosity, attentiveness, and human nature in its quietly complex form. In Flaxborough, the ordinary concealed extraordinary truths, and the patient, observant eye had once more unveiled them without disturbance. Pubright chose the late afternoon for his final visit to the hall, when the light fell softly through the high windows, casting the room in muted gold. The townsfolk had been summoned under the pretence of discussing preparations for the next flower show, Yet the inspector had orchestrated the gathering with a more deliberate purpose. Chairs were arranged informally, the green-stitched wallet and the slightly displaced vase placed unobtrusively where all could see them. The conversation began lightly, polite remarks about upcoming exhibits, the weather, and minor civic matters. Pubright allowed it to drift, watching the subtle behaviours he had noted over the past days. Tilling fussed over his papers, Eddington straightened his collar nervously, and Calendar, as ever, kept a composed exterior, though the habitual glance toward the wallet betrayed his attentiveness. After a measured pause, Pubright spoke, his voice calm yet precise, carrying the authority of careful observation rather than overt accusation. It has become apparent over the past days that minor events, a wallet found, a vase slightly displaced, have captured our attention more than might seem reasonable. We naturally tend to assign responsibility based on visible nervousness or proximity. Yet, as we have observed, human intention is often quieter, subtler, and more revealing in repetition than in a single act. All eyes were upon him, polite curiosity mingled with restrained tension. The wallet, with its distinctive green stitching, was placed and observed, not lost. The vase was nudged to test attention, not to disrupt. These acts, while seemingly minor, were instruments to reveal the attentiveness and habits of those around them, and the person who orchestrated these small disturbances did so with careful observation, civility, and patience. Calendar, momentarily silent, inclined his head slightly, the faintest acknowledgement of his role passing through the quiet. "Inspector," he murmured, "I only wish to see how closely my neighbours observed, to learn from the subtleties that otherwise go unnoticed." Pubright nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in a discreet smile. "Precisely. In doing so, you have revealed much about human nature in our town, how attentiveness, habit, and civility intertwine. The town remains orderly, yet these small insights, quietly gathered, enrich our understanding of the social fabric that governs Flaxborough." A polite murmur of approval passed among the residents. Tilling relaxed, Eddington allowed a faint smile, and even the vicar acknowledged the lesson with a nod. No one had been maligned, no reputation harmed, and yet the truth had emerged fully and elegantly without drama or confrontation. As the group dispersed, Pubright lingered for a moment, observing the sunlight catching the polished surfaces of the hall, noting the habitual gestures of his fellow townsfolk, now subtly altered by the insights of the past week. He collected the green-sticked wallet, carefully arranging it among his notes, and took his leave, stepping into the quiet streets of Flaxborough as the evening settled gently over the town. The routines of Flaxborough would continue, civil and unbroken, yet beneath the surface lingered the understanding born of careful observation, patience, and human subtlety. Pubright returned to his office, content that the minor disturbances had revealed not scandal, but the quiet truth of attentiveness, civility, and the understated complexity of human nature.